Hook my private lake. Peace. Hook Karen listed it on Airbnb without asking. Hook strangers showed up at my dock at dawn. Hook the HOA board just shrugged at me. Hook I stayed calm. Hook Karen's smile got tighter every single meeting. Hook she didn't know what I already had. Hook by the end, she'd be paying me rent. My name is Emily Carter, 38, a structural engineer who spent 6 years saving for the one thing my late grandfather promised me. A quiet lakeside cabin at the edge of Willowbrook Cove, where the water turned gold every evening and nobody ever bothered anyone. I moved in that spring with my 12-year-old son, Sam, 2 kayaks, and a stubborn hope that after my divorce, this small patch of shoreline would finally feel like something solid, something mine, something no one could take away from me again. Willowbrook Cove Estates was technically its own gated community, but my grandfather's parcel sat just outside the official boundary line, grandfathered in decades before the HOA existed, with private deeded lake access that predated every rule in their thick binder of bylaws. I didn't think much about the homeowners association at first.
Ipaid no duas.
Attended no meetings, and assumed the little dock behind my cabin was simply mine. The way my grandfather always described it. Nobody's business but ours. Eminencia. That assumption cracked the first week, when a woman in a visor and oversized sunglasses walked straight onto my dock, clipboard in hand, and informed me she was documenting compliance issues for properties along the water. Her name, she said with a practiced smile, was Karen Whitfield, president of the Willowbrook Cove Homeowners Association, and she wanted to welcome me to the neighborhood, while also noting 3 violations before I'd even unpacked my kayaks. I explained, politely, that my property wasn't part of the HOA. Karen's smile didn't move, but something behind her eyes flickered, like I'd said something inconvenient rather than something true. We'll see about that, she said, tapping her clipboard, and walked off toward her enormous white colonial overlooking the cove, the biggest house on the water, with a flag for every holiday already staked into the lawn. Neighbors warned me quickly, almost like a ritual. Karen had run off 3 families in 2 years, fines for mailbox colors, a lawsuit over a birdhouse, a woman reduced to tears over patio furniture visible from the road. Still, I told myself it wasn't my problem. My deed was clean, my land was mine, and I had actual documentation, an old survey, a title report, a letter my grandfather kept in a fireproof box for exactly this reason. Sam loved the lake immediately. He'd wake up before me just to fish off our little dock. And some mornings I'd find him sitting there in the fog, utterly unbothered, the way only a kid who's finally found stillness can be. Karen, on the other hand, seemed to notice everything. My car in the wrong spot, my trash bin out a day early, my kayak improperly stored, whatever that meant to a woman who didn't even own the shoreline it sat on. One evening she left a laminated notice taped to my door, listing community shoreline standards, complete with her signature and a fake official HOA seal that, I'd later learn, she designed herself using a font from a graphic design app. I called the county assessor's office the next morning, just to be safe. The woman on the phone confirmed exactly what my grandfather always said. My parcel was never annexed into Willowbrook Cove Estates. I owed the HOA nothing. I printed the confirmation, dropped it in an envelope, and left it politely in Karen's mailbox with a short note, happy to clarify boundaries anytime. Have a good evening. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. A truck from Lakeside Property Solutions LLC idled near my dock for nearly 20 minutes. A man photographing the water, the boathouse, even Sam's fishing rod propped against the railing. When I asked what he was doing, he said he was scouting for a listing. I told him this wasn't a rental property. He checked his phone, frowned, and said, "That's not what the listing says, ma'am." My stomach dropped. He hesitated, then turned his screen toward me, and there it was, my dock, my cabin's roofline, my grandfather's boathouse, listed on Airbnb under Private Lake Retreat, Willowbrook Cove. The listing description used phrases that felt eerily familiar: hidden gem, peaceful, gated shoreline, exclusive access arranged by community management. Whoever wrote it knew this property intimately, down to the exact angle of the sunset. I zoomed in on the host photo in the corner. It wasn't a stranger logo. It was a small circular headshot of Karen Whitfield, smiling the same tight, practice smile she'd given me on day one. My hands actually shook taking that first screenshot. Not from fear, from disbelief. This woman, who'd lectured me about community standards over a kayak, had quietly turned my private home into her personal side income. That night, after Sam went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, the screenshot glowing on the screen, and made a decision that would define the entire summer. I wasn't going to yell. I was going to document. I opened a folder on my desktop, named it simply Karen, and dropped the screenshot inside. It was the first of what would eventually become nearly 200 files. I had no idea yet how much I'd need them. The first guests arrived 4 days later, a couple in their 30s, wheeling suitcases down my gravel path like they owned the place, chatting about the private dock experience they'd read about in 5-star reviews. I stepped outside in my robe, coffee in hand, utterly bewildered as the man cheerfully asked where the check-in lockbox was. I told him, as calmly as I could manage, that there was no lockbox because this was my home. He pulled out his phone, showed me the confirmation, the address matching mine down to the unit number Karen had apparently invented. His girlfriend's face fell from excitement to embarrassment to suspicion, all in about 4 seconds. I apologized to them, not because it was my fault, but because they clearly weren't the villains here, and gently explained that whoever they'd booked through had no right to rent out this property at all. They left, confused and a little shaken, murmuring about a refund. I stood on my own porch, in my own robe, feeling violated in a way I hadn't expected, like a stranger had been living quietly inside my mailbox. I called the number listed on the Airbnb page, blocking my caller ID first. A cheerful voice picked up, "Lakeside Property Solutions. This is Deb. How can I help?" Deb, turned out, was Karen's cousin. I hung up before Deb could ask my name. Heart pounding. This wasn't some innocent mistake or clerical mix-up. This was a small, deliberate operation, dressed up with a fake LLC name to look legitimate to renters. I drove to the county clerk's office the next morning and pulled the business registration for Lakeside Property Solutions LLC. The registered agent's address matched Karen Whitfield's enormous white Colonial down to the unit number. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a long time after that, staring at the printout. Karen wasn't just an overzealous HOA president anymore. She was running an unauthorized short-term rental business off my property, under a fake company. That evening, I went to my first ever HOA meeting, uninvited, sitting quietly in the back row of the community clubhouse, watching Karen preside over the agenda with the confidence of someone who'd never once been challenged. When public comment opened, I stood, introduced myself, and calmly asked whether the board was aware that a property outside the HOA boundary had been listed for short-term rental under Lakeside Property Solutions, with photos taken without consent. The room went quiet, the place almost instantly. "That must be a misunderstanding," she said smoothly. "Probably some third-party scraping site. I'll have our compliance team look into it right away." I thanked her, sat back down, and said nothing more. I didn't need to argue in that room. I already had the screenshots, the LLC filing, and now, a room full of witnesses who'd heard her promise to look into it. 2 board members exchanged a glance during her response. A flicker of doubt I filed away mentally. One of them, an older man named Harold, caught my eye afterward and gave the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. Harold approached me in the parking lot as I was unlocking my car. "You're the Carter place, right? By the old boathouse." I nodded. He glanced back at the clubhouse. "Keep whatever you've got." I asked him what he meant, clearly weighing something, then simply said, "Karen's had money trouble. More than people know." Mailbox. Before walking off toward his truck without another word. That night I couldn't sleep. The lake go dark. Wondering what money trouble meant for a woman who lived in the biggest house in the neighborhood, with a leased Range Rover and a boat slip full of jet skis. The next morning, the Airbnb listing was gone. No apology, no explanation, just vanished, like it had never existed. I took a screenshot of the empty search results anyway, dating it carefully in my folder. I thought, foolishly, that this meant it was over. Karen had been caught, quietly corrected herself, and would go back to bothering people about mailbox paint colors instead of running side businesses off my dock. I was wrong. A manila envelope appeared taped to my front door, embossed with the same fake HOA seal from before, containing a formal-looking notice of violation and fine for $750. The violation code cited unauthorized structural modification to shared shoreline access, referring, apparently, to the small wooden bench my grandfather had built decades earlier, a bench that had been there longer than Karen's entire subdivision. I called the HOA management office listed on the letterhead. The number rang through to a voicemail box that, suspiciously, had Karen's own voice on the greeting, thanking callers for reaching Willowbrook Cove Community Management. There was no separate management company at all. Karen was the association president, the compliance officer, and apparently now the entire enforcement department, judge, jury, and self-appointed collector of fines from a homeowner who didn't even belong to her HOA. I wrote a formal letter back, citing the county records confirming my parcel's exemption, and mailed it certified so I'd have proof of delivery. I expected silence. Instead, I got a knock on my door 2 days later. It was Karen herself, holding a folder of updated boundary documentation that, upon inspection, was a hand-drawn map with my property circled in red marker and a note reading, "Pending Annexation Review, 2019. I asked to see the official annexation vote records. She said they were archived off-site and would take time to retrieve. I smiled and said I had all the time in the world, and closed the door gently. That week, my son Sam came home from riding his bike past the clubhouse looking rattled. "That lady stopped me," he said. "She said kids aren't allowed to ride bikes on community roads without a permit sticker." I felt something in my chest tighten that had nothing to do with property lines or fake LLCs. This wasn't about fences or dock permits anymore. Karen had spoken to my 12-year-old son like he was trespassing on her personal kingdom. I drove to the clubhouse the next day, calm on the outside, furious underneath, and asked Karen directly to never approach my son again without me present. She blinked, feigning innocence. I was simply informing him of the rules. "Dear, he's not part of your HOA," I said evenly. "Neither am I. This time, that neither of us will be contacted again outside a legitimate legal matter." Karen's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I don't think you understand how this community works," she said quietly, stepping closer. "People who don't cooperate here tend to have a very difficult time. Ask the Doyles. It's easier to just..." I didn't flinch. Exactly how it works, Karen. I've been documenting it for weeks. For the first time, her composure cracked. Just a flash. Gone as fast as it appeared. But I saw it. That night I called an old law school friend, Priya, now a real estate attorney 2 towns over. I explained everything: the fake fines, the Airbnb listing, the LLC registered to Karen's own address, the confrontation with Sam. Priya went quiet on the phone for a long moment, then said, "Emily, this isn't just an annoying neighbor anymore. This is fraud, harassment, and potential embezzlement. If she's been collecting fines, she has no legal authority to issue." She told me to keep documenting everything, every letter, every conversation, every date and time, and to never engage with Karen alone again without a witness or a recording. "Build the file," she said. "Let her keep talking." I started carrying my phone in my pocket, recording app ready, every time I stepped outside. Felt paranoid at first, almost silly, until the very next encounter proved exactly how necessary it had become. Karen showed up unannounced on a Saturday morning, this time with 2 board members trailing behind her like nervous interns, informing me the board had voted to install a shared gate at the end of my private driveway. I asked, recording quietly in my pocket, who exactly had voted, since I wasn't a member and had never been notified of any such meeting. Karen hesitated. A woman named Patty looked at her shoes. "It was a quorum decision," Karen said stiffly. I asked for the meeting minutes. She said they were still being finalized. I asked when the vote occurred. She said, "Recently," and refused to elaborate further. After they left, I transcribed the entire conversation word for word into my folder, now bursting with subfolders: fines, listings, LLC, harassment, witnesses. It was starting to look less like a neighbor dispute and more like a case file. 2 weeks passed with unnerving quiet. No fines, no visits, no strange trucks near the dock. I almost let myself relax until Harold, the older board member, appeared at my door one evening, looking pale and apologetic. "I need to show you something," he said, holding out a worn folder of his own. I've kept records for 3 years. Never had the nerve to use them. But what she did to your boy, that's a line she shouldn't have crossed. Inside Harold's folder were photocopies of HOA bank statements he'd quietly pulled as treasurer years earlier, statements showing thousands of dollars in consulting fees paid to Lakeside Property Solutions LLC, Karen's own shell company, disguised as landscaping invoices. My breath caught. Doc anymore. Karen had apparently been siphoning HOA funds for years, laundering them through fake vendor invoices, using the association's own dues to pay herself under a different name. Harold explained that he'd tried to raise concerns once at a board meeting years ago, only to be quietly voted off the finance committee the following month, replaced by Karen's sister-in-law, who rarely showed up to anything. Why now? I asked him. He looked out toward the dark water. Because I've got grandkids who ride bikes on that road too. And I'm tired of being scared of a woman who's just good at yelling louder than everyone else. I thanked him, promised to keep his name protected as long as possible, and added his documents into the growing file. What had started as an annoying neighbor dispute was quietly becoming something with real legal teeth. The following weekend, another Airbnb listing appeared, this time under a slightly different name, Willowbrook Cove Retreats, with new photos taken from a drone hovering suspiciously close to my property line at sunrise. I filed a complaint directly with Airbnb's trust and safety team, attaching the county exemption letter, the LLC registration, and screenshots of the listing itself. Within 48 hours, the listing was removed permanently, and the host account suspended. I imagined Karen's face when that notification hit her phone, and for the first time in weeks, I let myself smile a little. It wasn't a win yet. A very expensive-looking wall. Sure enough, 3 days later, a new fine appeared in my mailbox, $1,200 this time, for unauthorized commercial complaint activity damaging community reputation. I almost laughed out loud reading it. Karen was fining me for reporting her. I didn't pay it, obviously. I photographed it, dated it, and filed it neatly beside the others. Priya, my attorney friend, said this new fine alone was enough to file a formal cease and desist letter. So we did. For a while, things went strangely quiet. No fines. No unexpected visits. Karen even waved politely from her dock one morning, a gesture so unnervingly normal it made the hair on my arms stand up. Sam started riding his bike again without incident. I let myself breathe a little, cautiously, the way you do after a storm that might just be circling back around instead of actually passing over the neighborhood. Priya warned me not to mistake silence for surrender. People like this don't stop, she said. They regroup. To cover her tracks before you find something she really can't explain away. I kept working, kept documenting, kept quietly gathering neighbors' stories over coffee. The Doyle's fence dispute, the Fentons' lawsuit, 3 other families who'd quietly moved away rather than fight a woman with unlimited free time and a laminator. One afternoon, Patty, the board member who'd looked at her shoes during the gate conversation, approached me at the little grocery store near the highway, glancing over her shoulder before speaking barely above a whisper. She's under a lot of pressure, Patty admitted. The house. It's not what it looks like from outside. I asked what she meant. Patty just shook her head. She doesn't lose gracefully. That comment stuck with me for days. I started digging a little more, this time not into HOA records, but public county property records, tax filings, liens, anything a normal search might surface about the Whitfield estate. What I found stopped me cold. Karen's mansion, the biggest house in Willowbrook Cove, the one with a flag for every holiday, had 2 undischarged liens on it, and a notice of pending foreclosure filed just 4 months earlier. Suddenly, the fake LLC, the secret Airbnb listings, the embezzled consulting fees all made a horrible kind of sense. Karen wasn't a wealthy tyrant flexing power for fun. She was a desperate woman drowning in debt, grabbing at anything to stay afloat. It didn't make me sympathetic. If anything, it made the whole scheme feel colder. She targeted a single mother and her son's fishing dock to plug a hole in a financial disaster entirely of her own making. I told Priya everything. Then said something I hadn't fully considered yet. If this goes the way I think it will, Emily, you might end up in a position to buy that house yourself. I laughed it off at the time, distracted, focused only on stopping the harassment. I had no interest in mansions or flags or Karen's crumbling empire. I just wanted my dock back, and my son left alone. Still, the seed was planted. Somewhere in the back of my mind, next to the folder labeled Karen, a new thought quietly took root, one I wouldn't fully understand the shape of for weeks to come. The calm shattered on a Tuesday morning when I found a padlock bolted onto my own boathouse door, along with a bright orange notice declaring the structure seized pending HOA safety inspection, signed by Karen herself. I called Priya immediately, hands shaking with anger this time rather than fear. She confirmed what I already suspected. Karen had no legal authority to padlock private property she didn't even have jurisdiction over. We filed an emergency motion that same afternoon, along with a police report for what Priya bluntly called unlawful trespass and property interference. An officer came out, cut the padlock himself, and handed me the pieces without comment. Karen showed up moments later, practically sprinting down the gravel path, insisting to the officer that safety concerns justified her actions. The officer glanced at my exemption paperwork, then at her, and simply said, "Ma'am, this isn't your property." Her face went a shade I hadn't seen before, somewhere between fury and panic, as the officer suggested, quite plainly, that any further safety inspections without legal authority could result in a harassment charge against her personally. She stormed off without another word, but not before shooting me a look that felt less like anger and more like calculation, like a woman recalculating strategy rather than accepting defeat. I recorded every second of it. That evening, an anonymous email landed in my inbox with an attachment titled simply, "Listened MP3. No message, no sender name I recognized, just a file that, when I opened it with shaking hands, changed everything. It was a recording of a board meeting, clearly captured on someone's phone from a jacket pocket. Karen's voice unmistakable, laughing with another board member about milking the lake house listing before that woman figures it out. In the recording, she openly discussed reactivating the Airbnb listing under yet another name, joking that worst case, we blame a hacker, and mentioning she needed at least 6 more bookings before the bank calls again. I sat frozen at my kitchen table, replaying it 3 times, before forwarding it straight to Priya with a simple message. "I think someone on the board just handed us everything." Priya called back within minutes, practically breathless. "This is admission of intent, fraud, and financial motive, All in her own voice, she said. Emily, this isn't a neighbor dispute anymore. This is a case. For the first time, I understood we weren't just defending, we were building toward something bigger. I never learned for certain who sent that recording, though I had my suspicions. Harold denied it with a small, unreadable smile. Patty simply said, "Some things have a way of finding the right person," and changed the subject entirely. Emboldened, Karen escalated instead of retreating, perhaps sensing the walls closing in. A week later, a community safety notice went out to every household, falsely warning residents that my property had unresolved code violations posing fire hazards. Neighbors who barely knew me started giving my cabin wary looks on their evening walks. One woman actually crossed the street rather than pass in front of my driveway. Sam noticed too, quietly asking if we'd done something wrong. I sat him down that night and, in language a 12-year-old could understand, explained that sometimes people in charge lie to protect themselves, and that we hadn't done anything wrong at all, we'd simply refused to be pushed around. He absorbed that quietly, the way kids do when they're taking something seriously for the first time, then asked, "So are we going to win?" I told him the truth. I don't know yet. But we're not quitting. The false safety notice turned out to be its own mistake. Defamation Priya said we could absolutely pursue, especially paired with the recording, the fake fines, and the padlock incident. Karen's file was growing thick and undeniable. Priya suggested we send one final, carefully worded cease and desist letter before filing suit, giving Karen a clear, documented opportunity to stop. Sometimes people this far gone need one last rope before they hang themselves with it, she said. We sent it certified mail, copying the entire HOA board, laying out every violation in cold legal language: unauthorized rentals, fraudulent fines, unlawful property seizure, defamatory notices, and a demand to cease all contact immediately. Karen's response arrived not through her lawyer, but taped once again to my front door, a furious, misspelled letter accusing me of trying to destroy this community, and vowing she would never let outsiders win. I photographed it, added it to the folder, and felt something shift inside me. She wasn't strategizing anymore. She was unraveling, and unraveling people, I was learning, tend to make exactly the kind of mistakes that end them. 2 nights later, motion sensor lights near my boathouse flicked on at 2 a.m. I watched through the window as a figure in a dark jacket crept along the shoreline before hurrying back toward the Whitfield property. I didn't confront anyone. I simply called the non-emergency police line, reported suspicious activity, and let the responding officer's report, timestamped, official, impossible to argue with, become the newest addition to my file. The next morning, I discovered fishing line tangled deliberately around my dock support post, cut in a way that suggested sabotage rather than accident. Sam's favorite fishing spot had, quite literally, been targeted overnight. That was the moment something in me hardened completely. This wasn't about property values or petty rule enforcement anymore. Someone had come onto my land in the dark to interfere with my son's fishing line, and I wasn't going to let that go. I installed a second, hidden trail camera near the boathouse the very next day, angled to catch the dock, the shoreline path, and the tree line leading toward the Whitfield property, just in case history repeated itself. It did. Grainy infrared footage captured a figure unmistakably matching Karen's silhouette and her signature oversized visor, crouched near my dock at 1:47 a.m., fiddling with something near the water's edge. I didn't watch the footage alone. I brought Priya, Harold, and, at Priya's insistence, an off-duty detective she knew personally, all crowded around my laptop screen at midnight, watching a homeowners association president trespass in the dark like a burglar. The detective, a calm woman named Officer Reyes, said little at first, simply asking to see the footage twice more, then quietly requesting a copy for documentation purposes, her tone shifting from casual to distinctly professional. "This is enough for a formal criminal complaint," she said finally, "separate from whatever civil case your attorney's building. Trespassing, potential property tampering. At minimum." Harold exhaled slowly, like a weight he'd carried for years had finally shifted. We filed the criminal complaint the next morning. Karen was not arrested immediately. These things rarely move that fast, but an official notice was sent to her home, informing her she was now under active investigation. For the first time since I'd moved in, the neighborhood grapevine turned against her instead of me. Whispers spread fast in a community like Willowbrook Cove, and investigation was a word that traveled faster than any HOA newsletter ever had. Karen tried damage control at the next community meeting, standing at the podium with a brittle smile, insisting the entire situation was a misunderstanding stirred up by a disgruntled non-resident. Nobody in the room quite met her eyes this time. Harold, sitting near the front now instead of hiding in the back, calmly raised his hand and asked, in front of the entire community, whether the board had reviewed the financial statements he'd submitted to Priya's office. Karen's composure finally, visibly cracked. "That's confidential financial information," she snapped, before catching herself, realizing too late that she'd just confirmed, in front of 30 witnesses, that such statements existed and mattered enough to hide. A murmur rippled through the clubhouse. Patty stood up next, voice shaking but steady, and said she'd like to formally request an independent financial audit of the association's accounts for the past 3 years. 2 other members seconded it immediately. Karen tried to adjourn the meeting early, banging a small gavel she'd bought herself years ago, but the board's own bylaws required a majority vote to close early, and for once, she didn't have one. The audit motion passed 6-1. Karen the lone dissenting vote, sitting rigid at the head of the table as her own community, the one she'd ruled for years, quietly turned the machinery of her own rules against her. Walking to my car afterward, I felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not triumph exactly, but the quiet, steady feeling of watching gravity finally start doing its job on someone who'd spent years defying it. Priya called that night with updates from her contacts. The criminal investigation was proceeding, the audit was scheduled, and the bank holding Karen's mortgage had, according to public foreclosure filings, moved the auction date up by 6 weeks. "She's running out of time and running out of rooms to hide in," Priya said. "People like this always think they can outcharm the consequences. But paperwork doesn't care how good your smile is." I almost laughed at that. Karen, predictably, didn't slow down. She sped up. A new listing appeared online within days, this time not on Airbnb, which had banned her account, but on a lesser-known vacation rental site with looser verification standards. I reported it immediately, forwarding the same documentation package to the new platform's trust and safety team, along with a note mentioning the active police investigation. which apparently moved things along considerably faster than before. The listing vanished within 6 hours. Whatever desperate math Karen was doing to cover her mortgage payments, this scheme, the one she'd built her entire fraudulent side income around, was officially, permanently over. Without that income stream, and with the audit looming, Karen's financial unraveling accelerated visibly. Her Range Rover disappeared from the driveway one week, replaced by an older sedan I didn't recognize. Neighbors noticed. Her husband, a quiet man named Doug who I'd only ever seen mowing the lawn in silence, started appearing at community events alone, tight-lipped, avoiding questions about Karen's whereabouts with the practiced deflection of a man barely holding together. I felt, unexpectedly, a flicker of sympathy for Doug, a man who seemed increasingly like a bystander in his own marriage's slow-motion collapse. Caught in the wreckage of choices he may not have even known his wife was making. Then Karen crossed a line even I hadn't anticipated. Sam came home from school one afternoon, pale and quiet, and finally admitted that a woman matching Karen's description had approached him at the bus stop, alone, asking pointed questions about what mommy keeps in her files. Something in me went cold and very, very calm, the specific calm that comes right before real fury, the kind that doesn't shout, just acts. I called Priya, then Officer Reyes, then filed for an emergency restraining order the same day. The judge granted a temporary order within 48 hours. Given the trespassing footage, the padlock incident, and now direct contact with a minor, Karen was legally barred from coming within 500 feet of my property or my son. She violated it within a week. Spotted by a neighbor idling in her older sedan at the end of my driveway at dusk, watching the house through the windshield until Officer Reyes, called immediately, arrived and issued a formal citation. That citation became the turning point Priya had been quietly waiting for. Direct, documented, court-recognized violation of a legal order, layered on top of trespassing, fraud, and financial misconduct now under separate criminal review. She's stacking charges against herself faster than we could have built them, Priya said during our next call. Something like disbelief in her voice. I almost feel like we don't need to do anything else. Just knowing. Karen, seemingly aware the walls were closing in from every direction, made one final, reckless move. She attempted to quickly sell the mansion privately, off-market, to a cousin, apparently hoping to shield it from both the foreclosure and any eventual judgment against her. The transaction, rushed and sloppy, immediately caught the bank's attention as a potential fraudulent transfer, freezing the sale entirely and triggering an accelerated foreclosure timeline that would auction the house in just over a month. Doug filed for separation the same week, a detail that reached me only because Patty, of all people, texted me a screenshot of the county court filing with a single line. Thought you'd want to know. She's completely alone in this now. I didn't celebrate that particular piece of news. There's a strange, hollow feeling in watching someone's entire constructed life come apart. Even someone who caused you real harm. I simply added the filing date to my folder and kept moving forward. The independent audit, completed a week later, confirmed everything Harold had suspected for years. Over $180,000 in HOA funds funneled through fake vendor invoices to Karen's shell companies over 3 years, disguised as landscaping, security, and consulting. The board voted unanimously. Karen absent from the meeting entirely for the first time in memory, to remove her as president and refer the audit findings directly to the district attorney's office for a formal fraud investigation. Word of her removal spread through Willowbrook Cove like wildfire. The same neighbors who'd once crossed the street to avoid my cabin now stopped by, almost sheepishly, to say they'd suspected something was off with her for years. I didn't gloat. Thanked them for their honesty, and quietly noted, not for the first time, how much easier this entire ordeal would have been if that honesty had arrived a little sooner. Karen, cornered on nearly every front, made one last desperate attempt at leverage, showing up unannounced at my door, restraining order be damned, begging me to drop everything and testify that the whole thing had been a misunderstanding. I didn't open the door. I saw her through the peephole, then recorded through the window as she paced my porch, muttering, until officers arrived and arrested her on the spot for violating the restraining order. Watching her placed in the back of a patrol car, still in her visor, still clutching a folder of what I later learned were blank settlement documents she'd hoped I'd sign, felt less like victory and more like the natural conclusion of a long equation. The arrest made the local paper, a small article buried on page 6. But the headline was enough. Local HOA president arrested amid fraud investigation. Restraining order violation. I read it twice, then quietly closed the laptop. Sam asked if this meant it was finally over. I told him honestly that it meant one part was over, the scary part, the part with strangers at the bus stop. But there was still a long road of paperwork ahead of us. Priya confirmed the criminal case would take months, but the civil case for fraud, harassment, unlawful fines, and trespassing damages could move faster, especially with a district attorney's fraud referral strengthening our position considerably. We filed the civil suit that week, seeking damages for the padlocked boathouse, the fraudulent fines, emotional distress from the harassment of a minor, and punitive damages given the clear pattern of deliberate, repeated misconduct. Karen, out on bail and now facing both criminal and civil proceedings simultaneously, hired a lawyer who, according to Priya's contacts, quit within 3 weeks, citing irreconcilable client communication issues, a polite phrase for something far messier. The foreclosure auction date arrived before the lawsuits even reached mediation. I hadn't planned to attend, but Priya mentioned it casually, almost as an afterthought. You know, foreclosure auctions are public. Anyone can bid. Emily. Anyone at all. I sat with that thought for days, turning it over, remembering my grandfather's old fireproof box, the modest inheritance he'd left beyond just the cabin, money I'd never touched, saved quietly for something that matters, as he used to say. I called my financial advisor, ran the numbers late into the night, and realized, almost dizzily, that between my savings and my grandfather's inheritance, I could actually afford to bid, not on a whim, but as a real, calculated possibility. I didn't tell anyone at first, not even Priya, needing time to sit with a decision that felt enormous and strange. Buying the very house from which so much harassment had originated, transforming it from a symbol of fear into something else entirely. The morning of the auction, I stood at the edge of the courthouse steps in a plain blue coat, feeling nothing like the confident engineer I usually was, just a mother who'd been pushed too far and had finally found her footing. The bidding opened modestly, A few local investors testing the waters. Numbers climbing steadily as the auctioneer's voice fell into that practiced, rhythmic cadence auctions always seem to have. Oddly calm given the stakes in the room. I raised my number when it mattered. My voice steadier than I expected. Watching the investors glance at each other. Recalculating. Unwilling to chase a property with this much recent legal baggage attached to its name. Within 20 minutes, it was over. The gavel came down. Karen's mansion. The biggest house on the water. Flag for every holiday, belonged, on paper, to Emily Carter. My hands didn't shake. Not once. I drove home in stunned silence. Not to celebrate, but to sit on my own modest dock. The one that started all of this. And simply breathe. Watching the same gold evening light my grandfather always talked about settle over the water. Sam found me there an hour later. And when I told him what I'd done, his eyes went wide in a way that made me laugh for the first time in months. Wait, so we own her house now? The big one. Technically, I told him, still somewhat in disbelief myself. But we're not moving in. It's an investment. Didn't fully understand yet what that meant. He would, soon enough, along with everyone else in Willowbrook Cove. News of the auction spread through the community faster than any of Karen's fake notices ever had. The woman who'd once padlocked my boathouse now had no house of her own at all. Evicted within 30 days per the auction terms. I felt no urge to gloat publicly. I simply had Priya handle the formal eviction notice through proper legal channels. The same cold, procedural correctness Karen had once weaponized against families like the Doyles and the Fentons. Doug moved out quietly during that window, taking almost nothing, according to neighbors who watched from their porches with the same fascinated, uneasy silence people reserve for watching a house actually catch fire in slow motion. The civil lawsuit moved into mediation soon after. Karen's new attorney, her third, pushing hard for a settlement rather than risk a jury seeing the trespassing footage, the fraud documents, and a recording of her joking about milking my home. Priya laid out our terms plainly. Full restitution for damages. Formal admission of the fraudulent HOA fines. And, given Karen's severely limited remaining assets, a structured payment plan rather than a lump sum she clearly couldn't produce. Karen's attorney countered weakly, still trying to frame the entire ordeal as a misunderstanding between neighbors, a phrase that had, by this point, lost every ounce of credibility it might have once carried in that courthouse. I sat through the mediation session mostly silent, letting Priya do what she did best, watching Karen across the table looking smaller somehow, stripped of the visor, the clipboard, the entire performance of authority she'd built her identity around. At one point, our eyes met briefly across the table. There was no triumph in that moment. No satisfaction I'd expected to feel after everything. Just two women, exhausted, on opposite sides of a mess one of them had made. The mediator proposed a number that accounted for damages, legal fees, and the restraining order violation. Karen's attorney requested a short recess to confer privately, the kind of pause that usually meant a difficult conversation was happening on the other side of the wall. When they returned, Karen's attorney announced, flatly, that his client would accept the terms. Karen said nothing at all, staring at a spot on the table, the closest thing to defeat I'd seen from her in the entire ordeal. Outside the courthouse afterward, Standing in the parking lot with Priya, I finally let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding since the day that Airbnb couple wheeled their suitcases down my gravel driveway. "It's not over yet," Priya reminded me gently. "There's still the criminal case. And there's still the small matter of what you're going to do with a mansion you technically own but have absolutely no interest in living in." I hadn't fully worked that out yet myself. Part of me considered selling it immediately, cashing out, walking away from Willowbrook Cove entirely with Sam and never looking back at the woman who'd made our first months there so difficult. But something about that felt incomplete, like leaving a story half-finished. I thought about Harold's decade of silent frustration, about Patty's quiet whispered warnings, about every family who'd been chased out before I ever moved in. I decided, slowly, deliberately, that I wasn't going anywhere. Not the cabin, and not, eventually, the mansion either, though what I'd do with it would take a very different shape than anyone in Willowbrook Cove expected. The criminal case moved forward that autumn. The district attorney's office formally charging Karen with fraud, embezzlement, trespassing, and violation of a protective order. A stack of charges that made even the local paper's front page this time. I wasn't required to testify in person for every count, but I did. Once, sitting in a wood-paneled courtroom describing the padlock, the fake fines, the night my son was approached at the bus stop, my voice steady the entire time. Karen sat at the defense table throughout, noticeably thinner, wearing clothes that no longer looked tailored to a woman who once dripped confidence at every clubhouse meeting. She didn't look at me once during my testimony. Harold testified too, finally free of the fear that had kept him silent for years, laying out the falsified invoices in careful, methodical detail that even the defense attorney struggled to meaningfully challenge on cross-examination. The trial, mercifully, didn't drag on for months. The evidence, recordings, financial records, trail camera footage, restraining order violations was simply too complete, too layered, for any defense to dismantle it piece by piece. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Guilty on the fraud and embezzlement counts. Guilty on trespassing. Guilty on violating the protective order. The courtroom was quiet as the verdicts were read. No gasps. No drama, just quiet, procedural finality. Karen was sentenced to 18 months, with mandatory restitution to both the HOA and to me personally, a number that, combined with the civil settlement, would take her years to fully repay, assuming she ever found stable work again. I didn't attend the sentencing hearing. I'd said everything I needed to say on the witness stand months earlier. Instead, I spent that afternoon on my dock with Sam, teaching him to cast a line the way my grandfather once taught me. Word filtered back through Priya eventually. Karen, released after serving the majority of her sentence with good behavior, had nowhere to go. No house, no savings, a marriage dissolved, a reputation permanently attached to a fraud conviction in a small town where everyone remembered everything. I sat with that news for a long time, feeling the strange, uncomfortable mix of satisfaction and something almost like pity, remembering Doug's quiet, defeated face, remembering that even architects of their own downfall are still, underneath it, just people. I decided, finally, what to do with the mansion. Not sell it. Instead, with Priya's help, I converted it quietly into a small licensed guesthouse, legitimate this time, properly permitted, run transparently under my own name. Felt, in a strange, poetic way, like reclaiming exactly what Karen had tried to steal from me in the first place, except done honestly, legally, and without a single family ever showing up confused at someone else's front door. The guest house needed a caretaker, someone local, reliable, willing to handle basic maintenance and guest check-ins in exchange for reduced rent on the modest caretaker's cottage attached to the property. A small structure behind the main house. Patty, of all people, mentioned during a chance grocery store run that Karen, newly released and desperate for stable housing that would satisfy her parole conditions, had been quietly asking around the county for any kind of steady arrangement. I sat with that information for nearly a week, turning it over from every possible angle, weighing what my grandfather would think, what Sam would think, what kind of person I wanted to actually be at the end of all this. In the end, I didn't offer her the caretaker's cottage. I offered her something else entirely, a standard, fully documented month-to-month lease on the mansion itself, the very house she'd once ruled from, at fair market rent, $10,000 a month. It wasn't cruelty, whatever it might have looked like from outside. It was simply the honest market rate for a large lakefront property. The same rate I charged every other tenant. Applied evenly, exactly the way rules are supposed to work. Priya thought I was joking at first when I told her. "You want to rent Karen her old mansion?" "Emily, are you sure?" I told her I was completely sure. This wasn't revenge. It was just business, conducted properly. For once, Karen's response, when Priya delivered the offer through formal channels, was silence for 3 full days. I imagined her sitting somewhere, staring at that lease, turning over exactly the kind of question I'd once asked myself about her mailbox. On the 4th day, her signature arrived, notarized, on every page. No note. Just a signed month-to-month lease agreeing to pay $10,000 a month to live. Once again, inside the mansion she used to call her own. Moving day was quiet. By choice. Letting the property manager I'd hired handle the keys and the walkthrough professionally. The same way any legitimate landlord would treat any tenant, regardless of history. Sam asked me, that evening, if it felt strange knowing Karen was living in her old house again, just as a renter this time. I told him honestly that it felt less strange than he might expect. Mostly, it just felt fair. Fair wasn't a word I'd have used to describe anything in Willowbrook Cove a year earlier. But sitting on my own dock that evening, watching Sam cast his line into water that had always, truthfully, belonged to us, finally fit. The neighborhood slowly settled into a new rhythm after that. A properly elected board took over the HOA, run by Harold as interim president. Meetings now transparent. Minutes actually published. Fines applied evenly and explained clearly to anyone who asked. The Doyles, who'd moved away 2 years earlier after their own dispute with Karen, sent a card when they heard the news. A small, handwritten note that simply said, "Glad someone finally made her play by the rules for once." I framed that card, oddly enough, and hung it in the small office I kept for managing the guesthouse bookings, right next to the original county exemption letter that had started this entire chain of events so many months earlier. Karen kept largely to herself in the following months. According to occasional updates from the property manager, rent paid on time, no complaints filed, No visits from board members. No laminated notices taped to anyone's door ever again. I ran into her exactly once. At the small grocery store near the highway, both of us reaching for the same shelf of coffee filters. She looked older, quieter, the visor gone entirely, replaced by simple, unremarkable clothes. "Emily," she said, my name sounding strange in her mouth after so many months of dear and ma'am and clipboard formal address. I nodded politely, said anything else. There was, finally, nothing left worth saying. She paid for her groceries and left without another word, and I stood there a moment longer, coffee filters in hand, feeling the strange, settled quiet of a story that had finally, completely run its course. Sam is 14 now, taller than me, still fishing off that same small dock most mornings before school. The water still turning gold every evening exactly the way my grandfather always promised it would. All those years ago, the guest house runs quietly and legitimately, funding a good part of Sam's future college savings. A strange but undeniably fitting outcome for a scheme that once tried to steal exactly that kind of security away from us. Harold still stops by occasionally, coffee in hand, joking that Willowbrook Cove hasn't had a single laminated notice taped to anyone's door since the new board took over. A small, quiet miracle in a community that once lived in fear of them. Patty and I became genuine friends. Oddly enough, bonded by those quiet grocery store warnings that, in hindsight, had mattered more than either of us fully understood at the time she first whispered them to me. I think sometimes about that first week. The woman in the visor with her clipboard, informing me of violations before I'd even unpacked my kayaks. And how impossible it would have seemed then that I'd one day be her landlord. There's no dramatic final showdown to describe. No shouting match on a courthouse lawn. Just a slow, steady unraveling of someone who mistook control for security. And a slow, steady rebuilding of everything she tried to take from us. My grandfather used to say that water always finds its level eventually. No matter how many docks or fences or fake laminated seals anyone tries to put in its way. I understand that saying differently now than I ever did before. The lake is still quiet most mornings. The fog still settles the same way over the water. And Sam still wakes up earlier than me just to sit on that dock in stillness. The way only a kid who's finally safe can be. $10,000 arrives in the property account on the 1st of every month. On time. Without complaint. A strange, quiet echo of everything Karen once tried to build off my dock without asking a single permission. I don't think about her often anymore. The folder on my desktop, once bursting with subfolders, sits mostly untouched now. An archive of a season that tested us and, in the end, simply couldn't break what my grandfather built. Some nights, watching the sunset turn the water gold exactly the way he always described it, I think he'd have found the whole ending almost funny, not vengeful, just fitting, the kind of justice water finds on its own. Given enough time. Willowbrook Cove Estates has new families now. Drawn by word of a genuinely well-run community. Transparent meetings. Fair fines. A board that actually listens instead of laminating threats and taping them to strangers' front doors at dusk. I still don't pay HOA dues. My grandfather's exemption still stands. Unchanged. Exactly as it always was. The difference now is that nobody questions it. Nobody circles it in red marker. Nobody pretends the paperwork says otherwise. Sometimes new neighbors ask about the story. Having heard fragments of it secondhand at community potlucks, the Airbnb, the padlock, the mansion, and I tell them simply that everything worked out exactly the way the rules always should have. I never set out to become anyone's landlord, let alone the landlord of the very house whose owner once tried to steal my home out from under me. But some endings arrive sideways, built from patience rather than a plan. Karen still lives there, month to month, in the house with the flag for every holiday. Though I noticed on my one visit past the property that the flags themselves are gone now, the pole standing empty against the sky. I don't know what she thinks about. Alone in those big rooms she once filled with laminated notices and photographed violations. I only know the checks clear on time. And that, for now, is really all that matters. Priya still laughs about it sometimes, calling it the most satisfying case I never actually had to argue in front of a jury. A settlement, a conviction, and an accidental real estate deal all tangled into one improbable neighborhood story. Looking back, the twist I never saw coming wasn't the fraud, or the fines, or even the mansion. It was realizing that the loudest, most powerful person in a room is often the most frightened, hiding behind rules to mask how little control they actually have. Karen ruled Willowbrook Cove for years through fear alone. And it took one woman with a fireproof box full of her grandfather's paperwork, a folder labeled simply Karen, and a lot of patience to finally prove that fear isn't the same thing as authority. The bench my grandfather built, the one Karen once fined me over, still sits on the dock exactly where he placed it decades ago. Sam sands and restains it every summer now. A small, quiet tradition that feels like the truest kind of ownership. I keep the original fake HOA notice, the very first laminated one taped to my door that first week, framed now beside Harold's audit findings and the Doyle's handwritten card. A small, strange museum of a fight worth having. People ask sometimes if I feel guilty about the mansion, about renting it back to the very woman who tried to steal my home first. I tell them the truth. Guilt implies I did something wrong. I only ever followed the rules properly. This time, Karen taught me, inadvertently, more about boundaries than any therapist or lawyer ever could. That the people most insistent on controlling everyone else's space are often the ones most desperately trying to outrun the chaos in their own. I think about Doug occasionally too, wondering if he found something quieter somewhere else. Some version of peace that Willowbrook Cove, under Karen's rule, had never once offered anyone, including, in the end, even her. The lake doesn't care about any of it. Of course, not the fines, not the fraud, not the mansion changing hands, not the flags coming down from that empty pole. It just keeps turning gold every evening, exactly as it always has. Sam will inherit this cabin someday, the way I inherited it. And I hope by then the story of the Airbnb listing and the padlock and the courtroom will feel like nothing more than a strange bedtime story about a woman who mistook a lake for hers. For now, though, it's still fresh enough to matter. Fresh enough that I still smile a little every first of the month, watching $10,000 land quietly in the account. Proof that some debts, eventually, do get repaid in full. I never wanted to be anyone's cautionary tale, and I certainly never set out to become anyone's landlord. But sitting here now, dock warm under my feet, sun laughing somewhere behind me, I think my grandfather would call this exactly fair. The last laminated notice Karen ever left on my door is long gone from its original spot, replaced now by a small hand-painted sign Sam made one summer. Carter Family Dock. No permit required. Just good manners. It's a small, silly thing, barely visible from the water. But it says everything the story ever needed to say, that some places are simply ours. Quietly, permanently, no matter how loudly someone else once insisted otherwise. I still keep Priya's number saved as Lifesaver in my phone. A small joke between us now, though we both know how close things could have gone differently without careful documentation. Patient allies, and one anonymous recording that arrived at exactly the right moment. Harold retired from the board eventually, handing the presidency to Patty, who runs meetings now with the same fairness she once whispered about in a grocery store aisle. Quiet, steady contrast to everything Willowbrook Cove used to be. Every so often, I catch myself glancing toward the mansion across the cove, its flagpole still bare, and feel not triumph exactly, but something calmer, the particular peace of watching a story finally land where it always should have. I used to wonder what I'd say to Karen if we ever spoke again properly. Beyond coffee filters and silence. Now I don't think there's anything left to say. The rent arrives on time. That's its own kind of conversation. My grandfather's fireproof box still sits in my closet. Empty now of the original documents. All of them long since filed with courts and county offices. But I keep it anyway. A small reminder of where this entire fight actually began. Sometimes Sam asks what would have happened if I just paid that first fine. All those months ago. Just to keep the peace. I tell him honestly, I don't know. But I know I'm glad I never found out. What started as a woman circling my grandfather's old bench in red marker ended with her signing a lease for the very house she once thought made her untouchable. Proof that pretending to own something never quite the same as truly earning it. And somewhere across that same quiet lake, in a house with an empty flagpole, a woman who once ruled an entire neighborhood through fear now pays rent. On time. Every single month. To the family she once tried to erase. Willowbrook Cove healed slowly after that. The way places do once the fear finally lifts. Fences repainted without complaint. Kids riding bikes without permits. An entire community remembering what it felt like to simply exist without being watched. The HOA today functions the way one probably should. Quiet. Fair. Mostly invisible. Exactly the opposite of everything Karen once made it. Nobody misses the laminated notices. Nobody misses the visor. Everyone, quietly, misses nothing about those years at all. I still get the occasional new neighbor question about the lake house story, and I still give the same short answer. Everything worked out exactly the way it should have. Eventually, once enough patient, ordinary people simply refused to stay quiet. The dock, the bench, the gold evening light, none of it ever really changed through any of this. It was never about the property at all. It was about who got to decide the rules. And finally, rightly, that decision came back to where it belonged. $10,000 a month. Arriving quietly, without complaint, from a house that once tried to profit off my own front porch without asking, remains the strangest, most fitting postscript to a story that never should have needed one. My grandfather always said the lake keeps its own accounts, evening things out in its own time, long after everyone else has stopped watching. I believe him completely now, watching Sam cast his line into water that was always, quietly, only ever ours. Some fights aren't won with shouting, or clipboards, or laminated seals. They're won with patience, documentation, a few brave whispers in a grocery store aisle, and the quiet, unshakable certainty that some things simply were never anyone else's to take. The visor is gone. But the water still turns gold every evening over Willowbrook Cove. Exactly the way it always has. Exactly the way it always will. Long after every rule Karen ever invented has been quietly, permanently forgotten.